Honourable member for the Yukon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to stand in the House today and speak on the motions put forward to the House on Bill S-6. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to get to the contents of this bill shortly, and in direct respect to the motions that have been tabled here in the House. Before I do that, of course, I want to quickly express my thanks to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. I was here present in the House today listening to many of the speeches that were going on and some of the questions and answers that followed. And I'd like to say that it was appreciated that he recognized that our government has tremendous commitment to continued trilateral partnerships with both our public governments in the Yukon and with our First Nation leadership in our territory. Mr. Speaker, from that point of view, I'm optimistic and confident that the piece of legislation that we have before us, subject, of course, to continued dialogue and discussion, will be one that will indeed be in the best interests of all Yukoners. Mr. Speaker, I want to point out a couple of things before I get to the direct pieces of this legislation that are clearly worth highlighting. Some of that came in discussion today. Some of it's been prolonged discussion over the course of this bill. But it's absolutely worthwhile for us drilling right down to these very key pieces so that we can boil away some of the political rhetoric that's been around it, generated by the opposition side. Of course, Mr. Speaker, I do take some offense to the opposition's positions where they have clearly feigned concern for the wants, needs, and expectations of the Yukon people broadly, and specifically for the Yukon First Nation community. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, not tongue-in-cheek, I say that with clear-cut examples, and I'll give them to you now. I put forward a study in front of the Fisheries Committee some time ago where we would travel north and see what was going on with the challenging state of Yukon salmon, Yukon River salmon, in a trans-boundary relationship with Alaska and those waters. And there are some issues that we really needed to seize ourselves as parliamentarians in undertaking that study. But guess who blocked travel for that study? Guess who voted that wasn't important? They're the NDP. Oh. So this is a social, ceremonial, and traditional way of life for Yukon First Nations. Critical importance, Yukon River salmon. NDP wouldn't support that travel. So then I had a study before the House and a bill for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. That is certainly a topic seized by all Yukoners. An important issue to Yukon people and Northern Canadians in particular, all Canadians, and we wanted to travel for that. Guess who blocked that? The NDP. So they're continuing to block all these things, yet at the same time they say they've got care and concern for Yukon people, Northern people. While, Mr. Speaker, their record is clear. They really don't. And in this case, I was proud to ensure that as we undertook the study for S-6, I made it clear that we needed to bring the committee to the Yukon to hear directly from Yukon people to allow a balanced story and a balanced perspective and a balanced input. So we could seize ourselves with the concerns of Yukoners, we could understand them, and we could hear that directly from them in testimony in our territory. Of course, the NDP agreed to travel for that, but only for the fact that they thought they might have some political advantage here on this. And it's a shameful use of Yukon people and Northern people for their own political purposes. There is not true care and concern, and that point needs to be made crystal clear. Because I witnessed it. You know what I witnessed? That before noon on the first day of committee study on S-6, a member from a Liberal Party and a member from the NDP had clearly chosen a side, and it's on record when we were interviewed in CBC. They said their minds were made up, and this was done at noon before we'd even heard from half of the people prepared to testify. Before we'd heard a full and balanced perspective from Yukoners on this topic, the NDP had their minds made up about the direction they were going to go. And they said as much on CBC. The Liberals had their mind made up long before. So they say they came to hear from all Yukoners. But in fact, Mr. Speaker, their minds were made up before they arrived in my territory, and they tried to drive their political agenda. So it's important to me to communicate that very effectively here today, that everything to this point from their side of the House has been nothing but politics. There's been no care and concern for the people of the North, who we're trying to bring balance and a parity to in our territory, so they have equal opportunities for jobs, growth, and economic prosperity like the rest of Canada, so that they have equal opportunities like those shared in the Northwest Territories under their devolution agreements, under their resource development agreements that, interestingly enough, the member for the Northwest Territories was standing behind. But then when it comes to bringing parity to the Yukon, somehow he's objecting to that. But Mr. Speaker, let me say this. As we've tasked ourselves with this bill and understood in the evolution in the process, it's been clear there are concerns, and our government has seized themselves with those concerns. We've heard them clearly, and today we heard clearly the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs say that he fully understands that a trilateral relationship is important with the public government in the Yukon, Yukon Territorial Government, and Yukon First Nation people, and I applaud him, and indeed I thank him for that, because that will ensure effective implementation of this bill. It will ensure that we honor the spirit and the intention of the modern treaties that we have in our territory, those modern treaties that we're very proud of, and the modern treaties that will indeed continue to bring prosperity to our territory. Prosperity, Mr. Speaker, that the NDP really know nothing about. And you're going to say, well, can you prove it? Sure I can. So, on the record, in the Yukon legislature, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the territorial opposition had this to say about mining development in the Yukon. Once a mine is in operation, the actual procurement of everything, from I would say toilet paper to lettuce to whatever comes in on big trucks, on pallets from outside, nothing is sourced locally, said Liz Hanson, leader of the NDP in the Yukon. Of course, Mr. Speaker, as an example, and she was specifically referencing one mine, that mine spent $78.1 million in the Yukon Territory in 2013, wow. $58.2 million in the Yukon Territory in 2014 on goods and services before wages. Before wages to Yukon First Nation people, before wages to non-Yukon First Nation people, before those wages paid out, and then those employees in turn spent that money in their communities, in their homes, on goods and services, so the dollars continue to rotate around that community to the benefit and prosperity of all Yukoners. So, Mr. Speaker, my point with that is this, that if you start from a fundamental misunderstanding that mining and resource development actually contributes to our economy, if you don't understand that that's the case, then I guess it makes perfect sense that you wouldn't want development to carry forward. But the facts are clear, Mr. Speaker. $78.1 million in 1 year from one mine alone, contributing to Yukon's GDP, contributing to Yukon's economy, contributing to the socio-economic fabric of our territory, done so, I might add, in an environmentally responsible manner to protect and preserve the environmental heritage of our territory. Why? Because they engage in environmental reviews. They participate in those. They have care and concern about reclamation and development. They engage with their First Nation communities. And they don't do that always out of the legislative requirement. They do that because they form a social relationship and an important working relationship through IBAs, through direct community engagement and direct community participation in the Yukon with First Nation communities, who do indeed invite them in. So, Mr. Speaker, the NDP, the No Development Party, has no understanding, no fundamental understanding at all of the direct value that resource development brings to our territory, to the north, and to our country. So from that point of view, it makes sense that they want to obstruct these things. So, Mr. Speaker, I know I could talk a lot longer about this, and let me just say this. We've heard the concerns of Yukon First Nations. Our minister is committed to continuing to work with them in a trilateral relationship to make sure we engage in productive and cooperative implementation to honor the spirit and the intention of those modern treaties. And the motions that I see putting forward will actually reverse many of the things that Yukon First Nations, Yukon government, and Canada have already agreed to in the 5-year review of YESA. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions, and I look forward to the passage of this and our continued relationship building with all partners in the Yukon on a very important message and bill. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for the Northwest Territory.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for his interpretation of history, and because I always find it humorous when people want to do this to interpret history in a way that ignores the facts of the matter. And that's something that I think that every politician sometimes falls into that habit. But I think in this case, when he's talking about issues that Yukoners are very well apprised of, Mr. Speaker, I was amazed at the depth of knowledge that Yukoners had on these issues when we did conduct the committee meetings in Whitehorse. The 150 people that filled the room from morning till night, the engagement that Yukoners had in this. And I want to ask my colleague, he was there to hear Yukoners, but was he there to listen to Yukoners and understand what they were saying about the nature of the relationship between Yukoners, First Nations, and the environment?
The honourable member for the Yukon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and indeed I was. And in fact, I was very proud of all the Yukoners that participated in that hearing, from our First Nation right through our industry. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, it was my intervention that ensured that Yukon First Nations were a strong participant in that committee. And if he wants to talk, the member from Northwest Territories wants to talk about whether I was there to hear them. Indeed, I heard them, and I acknowledge that in the speech. I heard their concerns. But guess who didn't hear them? Guess who wasn't prepared to hear them? The member from the Northwest Territories, who by noon that day had said publicly on CBC that his mind was made up, he knew what he was going to do, he knew where his decisions lay, and that was before he'd heard from even half of the people invited to testify. So yes, I was there to hear them, but clearly the member for the Northwest Territories wasn't, and that's stamped in the record of that interview on CBC, on the noon show, and he can stand behind that deplorable record when it comes to standing up and listening to the Yukon people and the people of the North. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Labrador.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell you, if you want to hear political platitudes, you're hearing them today. I don't make no apologies for any remarks that I made on CBC up there, but the member for the Yukon should be making a lot of apologies, starting with his constituents, Mr. Speaker, for first of all, not even showing up at committee to support the recommendations that they basically drafted and asked members of the House of Commons to put forward on their behalf. His own constituents, Mr. Speaker, and he never showed up, the member for the Yukon, to vote on these amendments. His colleagues did not support these amendments. And if you want to talk about who made up their mind on this bill, it was the government opposite. When it went through the Senate with support of all the Conservative senators, when it was forced into the House of Commons without consultation from members in the Yukon and from First Nations governments. So I would like to ask the member opposite why he did not support the amendments that his own constituents asked for at the committee stage of the bill, if he was so committed to listening to them and doing what it was they felt was just and right.
The honourable member for Yukon.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? While I would have loved to have been there, I'm not going to apologize for being in Washington, D.C. to represent my constituents when it comes to important issues like the Arctic Council. And, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you right now that member who's talking about hearing and listening, it's interesting enough that I've acknowledged in my speech the 4 areas of concern that Yukon First Nations have. We heard those loud and clear. I acknowledge that the minister is committed to working in a trilateral relationship with them to ensure that the implementation meets their needs, meets the spirit and intention of their agreements, and this government is very much committed to that. And I look forward to that continued dialogue. But, Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that of the 4 points of concern, that Liberal member at report stage didn't address 2 of the most significant ones at all, didn't even put those amendments forward. Wow. So she clearly didn't hear or didn't listen, one of the 2, but it begs the question why they didn't do that. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, it was the Liberal senators that passed this bill out of the Senate into the House of Commons, absolutely unamended, with unanimous consent. So she's going to have to square that circle and quit playing politics with this issue and start listening to Northern Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.